We hear statements like God sees no color. We hear statements like slavery is over, it doesn't matter anymore. We hear statements like it's not racism, and even the thought of all lives matter, for example. So, my question being, and Pastor, we're going to start with you, move to Tracey, and then to Frank. How do you handle people who avoid the specific issues of racism towards blacks with comments like that?
That's exactly where the problem lies. Because the patient most times try to be their own doctors to diagnose their problem, and they're partial to themselves. Because they're absolutely blind and they're normal, their socialization is from a background that their paradigms are right. And so when they look out on others, they really cannot see what we feel. Number one, they don't have the lived experience, the daily experiences of a black person, and they don't spend the time to listen either, to know the realities of the pains of blacks. And so to make statements like slavery is over, God sees no color, I want to answer it like this. Yes, all lives matter. I want to say that all lives matter, from the life of the fetus in the womb to the old, aged man or woman that is still breathing. Life matters, and whether it's abortion or euthanasia or putting your knees in someone's neck until they die, that is where I disagree. All lives matter. That has to be settled in everyone's mind. As it relates to whether or not racism is not a problem, sin is a problem, you are also right. Sin is the problem, but racism is one of the symptoms of sin, and not until we're willing to face the fact that racism is a problem, we're not going to be able to move on. Slavery is over as it relates to the physical enslavement, but as it relates to the systemic suppression of blacks in particular, or other races that may be under that, but we're speaking tonight of black injustice. I do think for someone to say God doesn't see color, I'm going to say to that individual, number one, you don't know God. God made all men, and he made all men of one blood, but the ethnic diversity represented in shades and colors, whether it be the rainbow or the sky and the earth and the waters and the trees, God sees colors. So, if that be so, that we understand these things, I think every individual needs to know that their ethnicity, their color matters to themselves, matters to the fabric of humanity. And so I would say to the individual who says that, you need to, let's sit down and have a dialogue. Let's have a conversation so you can begin to understand what it is like to live a black experience in a racialized society. And we could say more about that, but I'll just turn it so we can get some more input.
Yeah, and this is why I think it's so important that the church, it needs to be aware of these injustices, because, you know, when I look to the church, I think it's very important that I see the answer. Because I think that racism is sin. And so, and if it is sin, then the answer is not going to come from the government, or the endeavors, though they may try, right? The answer, I believe, has to start with, or at least come from the church. And racism is a sin situation, and salvation is the answer to sin, and the church as an agent of salvation. So, I really believe that the church has to respond. And when people see the church and how we are able to, love one another without reservation and fervently, as the Bible says, that we can, and we work through this issue of racism, and it doesn't exist in the church, then the world can say, okay, this is where the answer is. Like, this is an issue that's been going on for a long time, right? And I believe that the answer can be found in the church, because racism is sin.
But when we have someone who professes to be a Christian, and I've seen it, heard it, where racism is dressed up in authority of leadership, and when you're told you can't date a black man or marry across the aisle of someone else, when you're told that, and the answer is, I'm not prejudiced, but it's preference. I think it is racism dressed up in very thin religious lingerie, and we're seeing the nakedness and the shame of this sin under that cover. And so we've got to get down to the fact that we must now begin to speak and allow everyone to understand that color matters, and we see color, but we're not using it as a means of dividing. We see it to appreciate the diversity of the human race, and the love of God should make us embrace one another, Jew, Gentile, black or white. And that's where we've got to begin to face the hard conversation that racism exists, and we cannot, which I may pick up on later, we cannot talk about it as though it's something of the past. And even if it's of the past, we are not prepared to shove it on the carpet and say, let's move on now. We've got to deal with the infection. We've got to remove the root cause. Otherwise, we're going to have a flare up now just because we have it in the headlines, and we go right back to the same subtleties or the same overt behaviors, and nothing is cured. So I think we have to have the open conversation on this.
When you take the resources from a community, you disadvantage that community, not just the present, but the future. It's as if, since I'm an accountant, I'll put it this way. If I gave you $1,000, or let's make it a little bit more in today's time, I gave you $100,000 and told you, buy some Apple shares or put it in the bank and leave it with a growing interest and don't touch it, and leave that for 3 generations, what would be the result and the impact on those children coming forward? Now imagine if I tell you that I'm going to give you a loan, and that loan is going to be like a mortgage, and interest is going to keep adding and adding and adding on it, and your children will have to bear the cost of that loan. That's what racism does. It takes away what belongs to a set of people, and you continue to enrich another group. And it's very dangerous when we try to pretend as if inside institutions, whether they be the church or they be the public sphere of government or the private sector, it matters when we don't put the most qualified and the most talented people forward for positions and for opportunities that would help to make our society much better than it is. Because we're not just talking about enriching blacks alone. We're talking about putting qualified people forward so that the entire Canadian society can be better. So for me, we need to look at it as a real issue. We need to educate people on the realities and the effects of racism.